You sit down on a stool at the end of the bar and look around. Your eyes rest on me as I take a drink from my glass. I smile inwardly and enter into a silent conversation with you, as if you're actually sitting here beside me. It's a conversation I've had many times and probably will again. I just wish you were someone else, someone I would rather be talking to. But you're here and he's not. In fact, he won't be here tonight or any night. As usual, that thought causes a flash of pain, but it seems to be less each time I feel it. After all, it's been 2 years. But, as I said, you're here tonight. So my imaginary conversation goes something like this. Hello, you're probably asking yourself right now, who the hell is she? I know I've seen her around, but I just can't place the name with the face. You would be right. You would recognize me if I was the face behind that glass screen, surrounded by that black plastic frame, and the studio backdrop was behind me. Right. My name is Megan Riley, and I'm an anchor on Channel 9, a channel you get right here in your little city. The problem you're having is that we're sitting in a bar on 7th Street in downtown Podunk City, USA, not my TV studio. You keep looking back at me as you sit at the bar, trying to convince yourself that it would be worth it to come over and try to hit on me. But then I see the hesitation in your eyes. Hell, I've seen it so many times before, and it was always the same reason. Just look at me. Have you ever seen anyone sitting in a bar alone that looked like me? Of course not. Beautiful women, especially ones that look like me with my long, wavy, platinum blonde hair. High cheekbones under clear, translucent skin. Eyes so blue most people thought they had to be contacts. A body that made men drool. Those women never sit alone in a bar in Podunk City. And I am sitting here alone. Why? Was a story in itself, and I am going to tell you all about it. First, you have to know who I really am. Not the public face and body that everyone sees. Not the voice of the network writers who tell me what to say. Not the story that holds your attention for the 3 days we allow it to dominate the airwaves. No, the real person behind all of that crap is the one who you have to understand my story. Next, know that regardless of how much you love to look at me and how much you think you admire me, I love to look at myself and I admired myself even more. Sound narcissistic? It is. Massively so. I am a narcissistic bitch. I have been since my early childhood when everyone told me how beautiful I was. I was a beautiful baby who grew into a beautiful child and later into a beautiful young woman. All through growing up, I remember people telling me how beautiful I was. I was almost 10 when I suddenly realized that when men told me I was beautiful, it sounded different than when women would tell me the same thing. That's when I realized that my looks and my body were things that men valued far more than women. My men teachers in grade school were far easier on me and gave me better grades than the women teachers. The same carried over into high school. I did nothing at that time to earn those marks, but I did understand that my looks were the key. I learned to smile mysteriously at the men teachers and the young men who surrounded me all through school, and as I graduated grade school, then high school and went on to college, I began to perfect those gifts that God gave me. You also have to understand how I grew up. My parents were strict evangelicals, and I was forbidden to date or to go out with even a group of girls during high school. I went all the way through high school as a virgin, and not only that, I had never been seriously kissed by a boy. I was almost 18 before I went out with a boy for the first time, and that was prom night. I was allowed to go because my dad was in the hospital with a massive stroke, and mom was with him, so I was staying with my aunt who said I could go. As a date, it was a bust. He was nervous at being with me, the most beautiful girl in school, and I was nervous being with him, the team quarterback, the most popular boy in school. I was afraid that my ignorance would turn him off, and he was afraid that his imagined lack of experience with beautiful women would make me think less of him. Together, we were hopeless. The night ended before midnight, and while many girls lost their virginity that night, I went to sleep, my virginity intact and my mind confused. Shortly after that, my dad died and my mom kept me home under a tight rein. That disastrous date was my first and only date with a boy until I graduated and went out on my own. I graduated high school, still chaste and still unsure of what I could accomplish. I was about to go out on my own with a full scholarship to college, and while I was anxious to be on my own, I was also afraid of what I didn't know. That confusion lasted only until my first semester in college. I was staying on campus in a room with 3 other girls, and when I was asked out by a boy in my freshman English class, I accepted. My roommates tried to prepare me for my first real date, but it was a bust again. He was nervous as usual, and I was afraid. As usual. It was like that until I went out with a senior boy who was very popular and who didn't seem to be awed by my beauty. He took me out for some dancing, then a few drinks later at the lake where we sat on a blanket looking at the moonlight reflecting off the lake. It should have been very romantic, but all he wanted to do was paw me and get into my pants. Fortunately for him, I was of the same mind. That was the night I lost my cherry, and it hurt like hell. I talked to my roommates about what happened, and believe it or not, they were a great source of help to me. I learned from them a lot of what I needed to know. But that night opened my eyes to my charms over men, and I began to be more selective in my choices. I now knew what it was like to have a boy between my legs, and it was okay, I guess. It wasn't a turn-on for me, but they sure liked it. I let a few more take me that first year, but more and more. I began to keep my legs shut and my eyes wide open. Opportunities presented themselves to me as the year went on. I quickly learned that a smile and a wide-eyed response made some of the male teachers look twice at me, and my grades seemed to respond accordingly. Just like high school. I began to use that mysterious smile I learned in high school, and my grades continued to improve. I even used it with some of the more butch women teachers with the same results. I was learning. I used my ample charms in my sophomore year for the first time to seduce one of my professors. I was having trouble with my first math course, and I needed the credit to go on in my chosen profession in communications. I decided one night as I sat in my dorm room studying that I would try something overt. In other words, I would actually do something to make him give me a good grade. I was 20 and he was closer to 60, but I decided he would be no challenge for my charms. So, after making an appointment, I found myself one afternoon on my knees in his office with the door closed and locked. What he asked and what I gave was enough to give me enough for his course. He made no trouble when I told him that was the price for my silence. The next 2 years were much the same. My dates were reserved for those who could do me some useful favor. That included professors, student advisors, student assistants. My grades were high and I had no trouble navigating my final years. I found during those years that using my looks and my body for personal gain had only good consequences. They were satisfied and I got what I wanted. So much for those dire warnings from my evangelical parents about the consequences of my actions. The only area where I actually applied myself honestly was in front of the camera. The camera loved me and I adored it. Together we were a team that even those who hated me and my looks agreed was one that had a great future. My life was preordained. I would be a media star. Fast forward a little. I graduated at 23 with outstanding grades and a recommendation from all of my instructors whose opinion counted. I applied for and got a position with CNN as a junior reporter. I began to film on-site interviews, and in only 4 years had a part-time gig on weekends. I parlayed that into a once-a-week show doing human interest stories, and finally, after paying my dues for 7 years, got an anchor position in prime time. My face was known by almost anybody who had a TV set, and I was making a nice living. During this time, my personal life was on hold. I dated a little, but as with college, my dates were with people who could help me in my career. Sex was not something I gave out much, and it certainly wasn't free. I was known as serious and cold and not available, but a very select few had sampled the charms that I had in ample quantity, and the rewards to me were well worth it. After all, I needed to maintain my public integrity, but for those who could move me up the ladder fast, I could be had. To be honest, sex held little appeal for me because I had never enjoyed it that much. Oh, I had very competent lovers at times, and they were able to draw me out as much as possible, but it was clear they enjoyed it more than I did. I had tried all style and some sideways sex. I enjoyed it all, but no more than delivering a good story in front of the camera. Actually, I loved the camera more than I liked sex. I learned early on to fake it most of the time, and I had gotten very good at that. I had to fake it almost all the time. Things remained much the same for the next 2 years, as I left the magic 30th birthday behind. In my profession, age was an enemy, as I well knew, watching other anchors get the boot and shoved aside. Since I was already an anchor and had achieved most of what I wanted in front of the camera, I decided to get into the management branch, where age was less a factor and more of a boost for your career. All I had to do was get someone to sponsor me and push for me. That chance came during one of our team meetings. Team meetings were meetings with the writers, anchors, news director or managers, and some of the network bigwigs. All were present when the direction of the next several weeks was laid out and agreed to. This meeting was one where I wanted to make my pitch to begin training in the background area of directing. I knew some would see it as a threat and would push back, but I had to try and get the ball rolling. I was prepared for this when the meeting was called. I would use my charms again to see what I could arrange. I dressed for the meeting accordingly with a short, tight black skirt that was 3 inches above the knee, a blouse with the top 3 buttons undone, and an understated look with my makeup. I brushed my hair until it shined and I used a touch of eyeshadow to bring out the blue in my eyes. I looked at the final effect in the mirror and told myself that someone was going to go down today. I would turn it on like never before, and honestly, when I did that, it was really something to see. At least, that's what many men have told me. As I sat at the table with my coworkers, waiting for the rest of the attendees to show up, I was aware of the looks from the men, as well as the women. The men were all trying hard not to pant, and the women were doing the same with their envy. I was oblivious to it all, having lived with it all my life. The reactions, however, were what I wanted when the rest arrived. I was not prepared for who did show up. Howard Rawlings, the station manager, Jeff Rawlings, his son and assistant, Julie Harris, the news director, 3 others in the accounting and advertising departments, and finally, Kendrick Lawless. Mr. Lawless was the sales director and vice president of the network news department. In effect, we all worked for him. But that was not what got to me. I took one look at him and suddenly understood what all those men had felt when they looked at me. I fell head over heels for him at first sight. The shock of that was like a bucket of cold water dumped over my head. I shook hands with him as he was introduced, and I don't remember what I said. I know I said something because he smiled at me, but I don't know what. I sat back down and watched him as he continued around the table, and then the meeting started. I tried to avoid staring at him, but I couldn't help it. Whatever he said or did, I was mesmerized. I was so confused and off-center that I can't remember the rest of the meeting. I know I didn't bring up my request to begin training, and I didn't even say a word during the information part. No one called on me, and I didn't volunteer. I was still stunned. As the meeting broke up, I remained sitting, my mind slowly clearing of its funk. I finally stood and walked out of the room, heading toward my cubicle. I was still trying to understand what had happened to me. I began to smile to myself, now aware of what I had been doing to men and boys for my whole life. God, it was terrible. I felt a sudden sympathy for them that lasted until I rounded the corner of the barrier wall between my cubicle and those of my coworkers. We all had cubicles instead of offices. He was sitting at my desk, waiting for me. I stopped, my throat squeezed shut, and my mind went blank again, just as it had been in the meeting. "Good morning, Miss Riley. I've been wanting to meet you for some time. I am very impressed with your work. Would you care to have a cup of coffee with me so that I could ask you some questions? It won't take very long." I swallowed and reached back inside myself for my confidence. I had so much, surely it couldn't have all disappeared. I tested my voice and found it relatively steady as I answered. "I would be happy to answer your questions. And please, call me Megan." "Wonderful. And you can call me Ken. My friends don't much like Kendrick or Mr. Lawless. Please, consider me a friend by all means." He rose and I followed him down the hall to our small cafeteria, ignoring the looks of the men and women around us. He motioned to one of the tables and I took a seat, letting him get the pot and some cups. He held up the cream and sugar with a raised eyebrow, and I declined both. He seemed to like that and brought the filled cups over to the table. As I watched him, some of my confidence returned, and by the time he sat down, I had myself under control, at least until he spoke. "Well, Megan, I guess you want to know why I asked you to have coffee with me. I hope you'll forgive me for my little lie. I don't want to ask you a bunch of questions. Actually, I only have one question to ask you. Would you have dinner with me tonight?" Without any hesitation, or without thinking it through for advantages, or if it had an edge for me, I said, "I would be happy to have dinner with you." He said he would pick me up at my apartment at 6:30 for dinner, and I said I would be ready. I was actually going out on a date with a man who could probably do me a lot of good, and I hadn't even considered that when I said yes. So on the one hand, this could be like all my dates, advantage to me. On the other hand, I had no interest in what he could do for me. None at all. Business was the furthest thing from my mind as I prepared for my date with Ken. Dressed in my sexiest dress, my makeup impeccably done and my accessories perfect, I waited for one of the sexiest men I had ever met to pick me up for dinner. I wanted nothing more than for him to find me attractive, and if he wanted to pursue anything tonight more than dinner or dancing, I was willing and able. I had worn my black lace bra and a black thong just in case. I was on birth control, so I never had to worry about that. As I waited, I thought about Ken Lawless. What was there about him that turned me on so? I had never had a man do that for me. I turned them on, not the other way around. This was not like anything I had ever felt. I began to think about sex with him. What would it be like? Could he make love with me and bring me to a climax? I had never had a climax with a man. The doorbell rang. I grabbed my purse and my wrap and opened the door. Ken stood there, a single rose in his hand, looking like the most perfect man I had ever seen. I was unable to say a word as he put the rose in my hand and smiled at me. He cleared his throat, bringing me back to reality. I took the rose and started toward the kitchen. "Excuse me, I'll put this in a vase and I'll be ready. Would you like a drink first? I have some scotch, I think. Somewhere. I know I have something. I don't drink much, so I never think about it. But I can look for it if you like." I knew I was babbling, but I couldn't stop. He was so perfect, so much a man. I found a bud vase and put the single perfect rose in it and set it on the counter. As I turned back around, I found myself in his arms. I stood there, rigid, hoping he would make a move and kiss me. And he did. Oh, did he? I felt his lips on mine, and the feeling was like nothing I had ever felt. I raised my arms and clasped them around his neck and pulled him closer. My lips opened to his questing tongue, and I allowed him full access. He welcomed me in, and we enjoyed each other as our kiss deepened. I felt a heat begin in my stomach, and it quickly moved up into my chest. One strong arm under my knees and the other around my shoulders. I held on to his neck with my arms as he carried me into my single bedroom. I wanted nothing more than for him to take me right then. I had known this man for no more than an hour, and I wanted him more than anyone I had ever met. I had to have him right then. I knew it was crazy, insane, but I didn't care. I wanted this here and now. Ken laid me softly on the bed, his arms sliding away from my body. I was breathing hard, looking into his eyes. I watched his hands as they unbuttoned my blouse and take off my skirt. I knew I was beautiful, and my body was enough to excite any man. I smiled as I watched the familiar look of lust grow in his eyes, but this time my smile was tempered with a tinge of fear. Fear of what I was going to feel with this man. I knew I was about to experience something unique to me at least, and I wanted it. Ken undressed quickly as I watched each move with eyes that never left his body. I wanted to do everything with him, and I wanted that very much. That was new and different for me. I held my breath as he moved his body over mine and settled between my legs. He held himself up on his elbows as he whispered into my ear. "I've dreamed about this every night as I watched you on my screen. It got so bad at times that I had to stop in the middle of a broadcast and take a cold shower. But now the reality is here beneath me, and it takes my breath away. God, Megan, I think I'm in love with you, and I just met you for real. You're better in reality than the dream or the picture. Make love to me now, Ken. Make me do everything you've imagined. I'm yours to do with as you want. Just do it now, please." And he did. He slid his body down, and when he was in position, we both pushed at the same time. I would feel the climax I had never had with a man. It was so intense and so beautiful, and I had no idea it could ever be this way. I was over 30 and had sex with dozens of men, but I had never felt this way in my life. I had no defense against this kind of joy. As I came down from the high I had achieved with my climax, I started to weep. I cried softly with the tears of joy only a woman can shed. "What's the matter, Megan? Are you okay? Is something wrong? Did I do something you didn't want?" I opened my eyes and stared into his concerned brown eyes just inches away. I could see the worry, the fear of a man who felt he had done something wrong even though he thought he was doing what the woman wanted. Why are we so complicated sometimes? Ken. No, you did everything just perfectly. You were just right, and I loved it very much. No, these tears are of joy, not sadness or regret. His smile was all I needed now to tell me he also had enjoyed me and my body. That was important to me now, while I had never had doubts before, or even cared if I pleasured the other man. I did now. I desperately wanted to please this man with everything I did, and I would do anything for him, anything he wanted. I was his, body and soul. We rested for only a few minutes, and then we did it again. We did everything I had ever thought about that night, and into the following morning. We did it all that night and the following morning, and I told Ken that I never wanted it to end. He promised it never would. That night was the first night of the beginning of what I thought of as my true entrance into the world of women. Before I was a woman among others, none of whom were of any importance. Now, I was a woman, and I related to all those others who lived to serve their man. And we did just that. If we were happy with them, we served them willingly, without complaint and with joy. Ken and I continued to be together, and after dating exclusively for 6 months, he asked me to marry him, and I agreed happily and joyfully. We planned a small wedding and spent 2 weeks together in Maui, hardly ever leaving the hotel. We were happy, and we planned our lives accordingly. My career resumed, and with Ken's help, my entrance into directing came true. He could get me in the door, but had little influence inside that world. I knew I could do the job, and he had faith as well. Over the next 2 years, we continued to love each other as often as we could, and we even slipped away during the day when he was in the building. I was still in love, and I had never felt more content. Ken was doing well in his career, and we were happy at home with all we had. We wanted nothing more than to continue as we were for a few more years before we decided on children. We both wanted them, but we felt it was too soon. We worked and built for our future. We had been married for 3 years and 5 months when Ken asked me if we should consider starting our family. I was 36 now, and he was almost 40, and the time seemed to be slipping by. I told him I wanted to direct my first full media event, and then I would retire happy. Then we would start our family. He asked if that would happen soon, and I promised him that it would be within the next few months. I had the script, the promise of financing, and the studio had agreed. It was almost a reality. I was in a planning meeting 2 weeks later when things started to go wrong. The script was done, but it needed some editing and rewrites in places. The writer had agreed to get the work done by the deadline, but he was too far behind to suit me. I dismissed the meeting and called him into my office to discuss the schedule. He agreed to meet me that afternoon. I had worked with him many times in the past and had no problems, but that was a long time ago. I didn't know what he was doing now. Drake came in that afternoon. He sat down across from me and began to talk about the problems with the dialogue and the scene changes. He was giving me a lot of technicalities and nothing of any real substance. I knew stalling when I saw it. He was stalling and I knew it. So did he. I had to get to the bottom of things right now. Drake, what the hell is going on? You know how to fix this, so why the stall tactics? He pushed the script into his briefcase and hesitated before looking back up at me. I saw something in his face I didn't like. I waited, almost sure of what I was to hear. You and I have worked together before, Meg. You remember the Timberlake project? We really pulled that one off, and you got a good raise and a promotion from that one, if I remember. I did remember. It was a real coup for me, and it did result in what he said. What he didn't say was the price I paid for his cooperation. He wanted sex with me to make the schedule, and I agreed. After all, it was for me and my goals, and he meant nothing to me. So, a quick sex in my office after hours, and he was back on schedule the following day. That's what I did, and it meant nothing to me. But now? How could I justify that now? I considered what he was asking, and I told him to call me in 2 hours. I would talk to him then. He smiled, said that he was sure we could work this out, grabbed his things and hurried out of the office. I watched him go with disgust, but also with the understanding of what it would take to get him on schedule, and the script finished on time. I made a few calls to other writers, but got nothing but vague promises and brush-offs. I was out of options with the time running out. I worried the idea for the next 2 hours and came to a decision. I wanted to do this project, make my successful debut into directing, and then retire on top. I was a household face and my name was known by half the world. I was a success in broadcast TV. Now, I wanted to go out with my name on a successful documentary. And it was for Ken and me that I wanted to finish this. We wanted a family, and I had promised that after this project, it would be time. Ken was excited and anxious to begin, as was I. All I had to do was finish this project. 2 months and it would be done. If Drake was on time, and I knew how to make Drake on time. How bad did I want this? Was it worth what Drake was demanding? Could I just let it go and retire anyway? I weighed the pros and the cons of what I had to decide and made a decision. I fell back on my past and the knowledge that what I did was for my own goals and meant nothing more than that. It was for my marriage after all, and that wasn't cheating. When the phone rang, I picked it up. It was Drake. I simply said, "Call me back and tell me where to be 3 hours from now." I hit the disconnect and then dialed Ken. He was supposed to work late that night, so I wanted to tell him I would stay for an extra hour and then go home. He wasn't in, so I left the message on his voicemail. All I had to do now was get Drake off my back and the project on schedule. 2 more months and it would be over. Ken and I could start our family. I was getting excited now. Just do Drake and get it over with. Just once and no more. It was just business, just like it always was before. Just like before. I told myself that over and over until I began to believe it. It would just be business and nothing more. I finished my work and went into the restroom to prepare for Drake. I inserted a diaphragm just to be extra careful. As I inserted the device, I thought back to my times with Drake. He really wasn't all that bad. He was more forceful than most, and he almost got me off a few times. And he was certainly male. A body that was very nicely proportioned. Maybe this wouldn't be all bad. I got a condom from the vending machine in the executive washroom for his visit. He would wear it or it wouldn't happen. With those preparations, I felt ready for this. All I had to do was get through it. As I walked back to my office, I remembered how it used to be with these men who wanted to get their rocks off in a body that millions of men desired. That's all it was, just a male superiority thing. I was beautiful and known, and they were nobodies. But this way, they felt superior to all those others who dreamed but were denied. They would proudly tell themselves that they had that beautiful woman on screen. Oh yes, I understood it. I first understood it at age 10 and never forgot it. Ken had changed my life, however, and made me a woman instead of an icon. I loved him for that. I walked into my office and sat back to wait for Drake's call. I had no more than sat down when the phone rang. I answered and it was Drake. Okay, Drake, where and when? We had done this before. There was to be no love, no foreplay, no hesitation. Just get it over with. Meet me at the Dunes Motel on 5th Street as soon as you can. Room 114. Okay, fine. I am on my way. I hung up and was surprised at the warm rush that came over me. I knew that feeling, but I hadn't felt it for some time. I was excited. This was not new, but this was the first time since I had been married. Was it the forbidden part that was exciting? I had no idea, but it was definitely exciting. I locked my office and got my car and drove over to 5th Street. It was not a very nice neighborhood, and I was nervous. My Beamer was going to be out of place here. At least I thought that until I pulled into the lot. Most of the cars there were nicer than mine. I guess having a day rate was what pulled in the cheaters like me. I parked toward the rear of the lot, donned my big dark glasses, put on my hat, and walked back to room 114 and knocked. Drake answered almost immediately and pulled me inside. It was a dark and dingy room with a double bed and a spread the color of baby crap. The walls were cheap synthetic wood paneling, and the carpet was a mud-brown color. There was one light on near the bed, and the spread was pulled back, inviting the weary traveler. What a joke. Weary traveler, my bum. It was for people like me to spend an hour or so screwing someone they shouldn't be. I should know since I spent a lot of time in my early career in rooms like this. I went past Drake and into the bathroom where I washed my hands and rinsed out my mouth. I felt dirty already and my mouth was dry from my nervousness. I knew this was wrong, but it was necessary, as it had been necessary so many times in my career. Some had money, many had power. I had a body and a face that men desired. It was a price I paid to get where I was. I had thought it was over when I married Ken, but I had to do it this one more time. I walked back out into the room and sat down on the bed. I had tried all of them without finding any that were exceptional. Except my Ken. He was mine and mine alone, and that made him the exception. Once Drake was ready, Elle leaned back on my elbows and watched him as he climbed onto the bed beside me. I admired his buff body, but reminded myself that this was business and not pleasure. Unfortunately, Ken had taught me what pleasure could be when having sex, and my thoughts were not as pure as they should be. I felt a warmth that surprised me. I knew it was anticipation, and I expected to feel what I felt when Ken was with me. But he wasn't here now, Drake was. I decided to try to keep this strictly on the job. Okay, do what you have to do. Just don't expect me to enjoy it or help you any. Oh, come on, Meg. You always enjoyed it before. I know you did because you had a climax or two. Not that bad, really, was it? Didn't I try to make it fun for you as well? I had to admit he did, and I had convinced him that I had a climax. So what if he believed me? Yeah, I guess, but I'm a married woman now and this is cheating. I don't want to be here, but you gave me no choice if I want to pull this documentary off. So, just get to it and get it over with. I'll do my part. I worked on Drake for a few minutes with my hands, and then gave him B-job. I had to do this just to get him ready to do me fast. What disturbed me was that I was aroused by what I was doing, so by the time he was ready, he pleased me with all his techniques. I was definitely feeling it now. We remained that way for a few minutes as we both came down from our high. We were panting as we relaxed. I realized that this had been more than I expected or even wanted. This kind of pleasure was supposed to be reserved for my husband and only for him. But Ken had awakened my pleasure centers, so that now when I was doing something I considered only business, something unexpected happened, and that was something new for me. I had to think about this some more. He asked me to go for second round. I actually considered it before my conscience kicked in. I couldn't do this. I was married and I had made a promise. I broke one promise, but only so I could keep another, one I considered more important. Our family. Sorry, Drake. That's it. You promised and I delivered. So, keep your word and do the work. Have the finished script on my desk by tomorrow. Close of business. Drake looked at me for a second before nodding his head. You got it. You delivered and I made a deal. I'll have it for you by end of day. I got up, went into the bathroom, and washed my face and hands again. I wiped my naked body with a damp washcloth and dried myself on one of the scratchy towels supplied by management. I brushed my hair and reapplied my lipstick. I looked at the face in the mirror and shuddered. I didn't like what I had just done, but I considered it necessary. I wished at that point that I hadn't enjoyed it as much as I did. I closed my eyes as a wave of pain washed over me and waited until the spasm passed before walking back out to find Drake dressed and waiting. He nodded toward the door. Why don't you go out first, and I'll wait for a few minutes before I leave. Okay, fine. See that the script is finished on time. Goodbye, Drake. And thanks for at least making it pleasant. Anytime, Angel Face. Anytime at all. Just let me know and I'll make the arrangements. As I drove home, I began to feel the guilt start in my gut and work its way upward into my chest until it was almost choking me. I pulled over and began to cry. I stayed there on the side of the road for a long time, trying to stop the tears that were flooding my eyes. I knew what I did and I told myself that it was for the right reasons, but I knew that I could have found another way if I wanted to. Then it came to me in a flash of insight that added to my feelings of guilt. I did what I did for the thrill of doing it. I couldn't lie to myself any longer. I knew Drake and I knew what he could do and that I would enjoy it. I lied to myself all day, and when he called, I was more than ready. And to be honest, I loved it. I wiped my face and finally started the car and drove for home. I was confused and sick with worry. I couldn't let Ken know what I did, and I was going to be sick with worry that he could find out. I didn't know what he would do if he did, but I would die if he left me. That was the way I was thinking as I walked into our home. Ken wasn't there yet, but he would be home soon, so I had some time to get my act together and make sure he wouldn't suspect anything. I went upstairs to change, and while I was at it, I took another swipe at cleaning myself off just in case. No shower for me. That would just raise a red flag that said, "Look at me." I took a shower in the middle of the day for no reason. I fixed a quick dinner and had it ready when Ken come in. He gave me his usual kiss and hug before rushing upstairs to shed his suit and tie. We had a nice dinner, with easy conversation and no tension. I kept it together very well, and then it was time for bed. I waited until Ken joined me, and then I initiated a bout of lovemaking that blew his head off. When he asked where that came from, I just laughed in glee and told him I had read a racy script that very day that had turned me on. I knew how close to the truth that was, but he bought it and I relaxed. So, I got away with it and the script would be done and on time just as promised. I went back to work the following day, and reviewed my project schedule. It would take at least the 2 months I planned and perhaps a lot more. But it was time to begin and see what developed. We began work on the documentary immediately, and I was soon deeply involved in all aspects of it. I kept up with my evening anchor job, but during the day and into several evenings a week, I worked on my project. My next week or two would be rather hectic, but I let Ken know that I would be sure to free up my weekends for us. He accepted it as I knew he would. He had always been my #1 supporter. As I worked, I came in contact with Drake several times. He was very helpful and he was never far from my side as we worked, since there were always minor changes in the dialogue as things progressed. It was 2 weeks after we began that he asked me if I would consider another meeting after hours at the dunes. I said no, of course, but the thought wouldn't go away. During a break from shooting, I tried to figure out why I was so uneasy about what he was asking. Ken and I had been having a lot of sex lately, mainly due to my guilt feelings, but also because we had discussed starting our family, and he always joked about getting enough practice. We made love 2 or 3 times a week now, so there was no problem with my libido. But I had to admit to myself, that was part of the problem. We made love. When Drake took me in the room at the Dunes Motel, that's exactly what he did. He took me. He didn't make love to me or try to please me. He just screwed me hard. And he didn't worry about my climax, although I did have one anyway. I began to understand that this was the difference that I had noticed. This was more like what I had been doing before I met Ken. From the day I met him, I had been faithful to him except for the one time with Drake. Ken and I made love, and I loved that with Ken. But I also understood that just screwing for the fun of it with someone like Drake, who cared not a bit about me or my satisfaction, was somehow exciting to me as well. Then there was the other thing. I had learned how good some hard-driving sex could be from Ken. He taught me that making love was wonderful, but that having sex for the fun of it could be wonderful as well. We didn't do that often enough. But I also knew Ken could never just take me and ignore my pleasure. That was not who he was, and the idea of pleasing himself and not me was foreign to him. I had to admit to myself that I missed that. That was why that evening with Drake was so good. I enjoyed it. I really enjoyed what he did, and I was disappointed that we didn't do more. But that night, I had to get home to Ken, my husband. I was now more confused than before, and I had no idea what to do. Drake's invitation was still on my mind, and I was conflicted, but I had no intention of cheating on Ken anymore. That was the way I was thinking when Ken told me he had to fly out to the West Coast for 2 days. Since I was so involved in my project, he hadn't even thought to ask me to go with him. Of course, I wouldn't have been able to go anyway, but I was a little upset by his not asking. Go figure. I didn't say anything to him, but I let it stew in my mind until he was ready to leave. I understood later that I was trying desperately to find some justification to do what I wanted to do. By the time he pulled out to head to the airport, I had given him no reason to suspect that I was unhappy with him, but in truth, I had made up my mind. That day when I saw Drake, I beckoned him over and told him I was ready to meet him that very evening. He smiled and said he would give me the room number later. I spent the remainder of the day doing the necessary things for the project, but my mind was already in that room with Drake. I was becoming more and more anxious for this day to end. I expected a call from Ken at 8 that evening, so I had plenty of time. I told him to call my cell since I might just stay at work since he wasn't going to be home. I met Drake that evening at the Dunes Motel in room 136, and we did it all. I told Drake to take me and not let me look back. I wanted to have hot, heavy sex, and I didn't want him to be easy about it. Drake understood what I was saying, and he did exactly what I asked. He actually picked me up the first time. As he took me, I screamed my pleasure as I felt the rough wall abrading my back and my arse. That was only the first of many new experiences that night. By the time we had to stop to catch our breaths, I had already climaxed twice and was ready to have a third when Drake pleaded exhaustion. The only uncomfortable point came about 2 hours into our session when my cell rang. It was Ken, letting me know he had landed and was going directly into a meeting and would call later than planned. We talked for only a few minutes before we disconnected, but that call put a pall over the whole thing, and I told Drake I was done for the day. He just laughed at me and pulled me down to the floor and stuck his meat in my mouth, holding my hair to keep me in place. I forgot about Ken at that instant and did exactly what Drake wanted me to do. We stayed together for the next 2 hours and Drake wore me out. I loved everything about that night. I promised to meet him again the next night at the same time. He said he would keep the room just in case I got itchy tonight. That started my affair with Drake. I met him on those evenings I told Ken I was staying at work, and we had an amazing sex in every way possible. I loved every minute of it, and I began to think about him, even when I was making love with Ken. I knew I was addicted to the amazing sex, but I couldn't stop it. I kept it alive for the next 5 weeks until all hell came down on my head. I had just left the motel room after 2 hours of intense sex with Drake and was headed home. I was still flushed with pleasure, but that would be gone by the time I got home. Since Drake continued to use condoms, there was never any evidence to get rid of. As usual after being with Drake, I was eager to make love with Ken that night. I needed him to love away the reminder of my submissive nature with Drake. With Ken I could be a partner, and we would make love together. That made what I did with Drake less important. That was so important to me, and it was what made the affair possible. Ironic? Of course, but then nothing about an affair was very logical. I walked into the kitchen that night and found Ken sitting alone with a glass of whiskey in his hands, rubbing the glass against his forehead. He looked so strange sitting there. The whiskey was also different. Ken hardly ever drank alcohol and never at home by himself. Something was wrong, and the first thing that entered my head was my affair with Drake. Could Ken have found out about that? No, it's impossible. I left no clues, made no mistakes, and left no paper trail of any kind. No, it had to be something else. Ken, honey, what's wrong? You look upset, and you're drinking. What's wrong? He didn't even look up at me, just continued to stare into the amber-colored fluid in his glass. When he started to speak, it was so low I had to move closer just to hear him. I was just remembering the plans you and I made not more than a month ago about having a family. We talked about having children and what we would do when we did. We talked about saving for their education and taking them on trips to show them as much of the world as we could. They were beautiful dreams, weren't they? Of course they are, and they'll all come true. We'll do all those things for them, and we'll do them together. Why would you talk about them now? Come on, Ken. Something's very wrong. Please, tell me. Let me help you if I can. Now Ken put the glass down and looked up at me. Then I saw the anger in his eyes and the tightness of his lips pressed together. Suddenly I felt a rush of fear as I understood in that instant from the look in his eyes that he knew. He knew. Oh, God in heaven. How could he know? Ken? Please, Ken. You're scaring me. What's wrong? I knew, but foolishly I prayed that he wouldn't say the words that would confirm it. Oh, please, God. Please don't let him say the words. Why, Megan? Why would you do something like this to us and our dreams? Why would you throw it all away? What did you need that I couldn't provide for you? Tell me, Megan, why you did it. Before I could answer, he stood up quickly, grabbed my shoulders in his hands, and almost shook me as he screamed it out loud directly into my face. I guess it doesn't really matter, why does it? You did it, and that's what's important. You and Drake, screwing each other in that motel room for the last 5 weeks. You screwed away all we had, Megan. You just screwed it all away, and I don't know why. He let me go, and I watched him sink to the floor onto his knees, holding his head as he cried. My heart broke watching him. It broke because I knew he was crying because of me. I did this. I did this to the only man I had ever loved, or probably ever would love. I couldn't imagine a life without him, and now I had broken his heart. I dropped to the floor in front of him and put my arms around him and held him as tightly as I could. I did it to comfort him, out of instinct. My Ken was hurting, and all I could think of was to comfort him. But inside, I knew that I did it because it was possible that I would never be able to hold the man I loved in this way again. Now, he was in pain and I could do this until he recovered. But as soon as he did, I knew he would push me away in anger and disgust. After several minutes, I felt his shoulders tense, and then, as I knew he would, he pushed me back and stood. He walked over to the table and sat down again. He picked up the glass and drained the fluid in one swallow. His eyes watered, but because of the alcohol, not because of me. That made it possible for me to rise and take a seat across from him. Can I try to explain, Ken? Would you at least let me tell you why? I felt he should hear that I didn't stop loving him and that I never felt anything for Drake at all. I wanted to tell him that. I don't really care why you did it, Meg. The fact was that the first time you did it, our marriage was over. I knew who you were when I asked you to marry me. And I knew that men desired you, but I always told myself that you chose me, and that was enough for me. But it wasn't. I needed to know that you would always choose me, not just sometimes. But you didn't, and it doesn't matter to me why. I don't care anymore. I've had time to come to grips with your cheating, and I've been able to convince myself that I can get by without you. All it took was a few pictures of what the two of you did, and that was enough to tear my heart right out of my chest. I felt his hands grip my heart as he gripped you, and then he tore it out with his treatment of you. My love died when I saw that you enjoyed what he did and how he treated you. It disappeared when I realized it wasn't the first time. I tried to say something, anything, to make him see that what he imagined wasn't what happened. I tried to tell him that Drake was nothing more than a sex toy that I used to give me something that I didn't want from my husband and the man I loved. I screamed at him. I reached for him. I got down on my knees and begged him, but he turned away from me. He ignored my pleas, my cries, my prayers. He refused to acknowledge me, and I finally just stopped. I sank down onto a chair and put my head down on my crossed arms and wept. I didn't hear him leave. When I finally lifted my head and looked around, all I saw was an envelope laying on the table in front of me. On top of the envelope was his wedding ring. The diamond-cut gold surface winked back at me as I took it in my fingers and held it up to the light. Such a beautiful thing to signal the end of something else that had been so beautiful. I knew what was inside the envelope, and it was hours later before I opened it. I read it carelessly and signed it in the places he had highlighted. I found later it was a very fair settlement. I never doubted it. I finished my documentary. It was no problem since the divorce took very little of my time. Of course, Ken handled everything. He never spoke to me again except in the presence of our attorneys. My documentary was shown, and it was very successful, and the news was that I was an up-and-coming director. Maybe I could have been, but I didn't follow up on that first success. Once the divorce was final, I quit the station and moved away to the Midwest somewhere. It really doesn't matter where. I found a job with a small local station, and I did the news, the weather, and some journalistic reporting. Because of my competence, I was soon made managing director, and I took care of everything. I was very well known around the area, and several articles wondered at someone as beautiful as me in a small market like this. I smiled as I read them, knowing that they were right to wonder. But I had no desire to change my location. I liked it where I was. Every evening as I prepared to leave, I turned the duty over to the night manager and told her not to call me for any reason other than a nuclear attack on the US. Anything else was a no-call. She understood and so far had never called me. That's why I kept her around. Actually, most of what we ran after midnight was movies and documentaries. We even ran mine once that I knew of. When I left work, my routine was pretty much the same. I would go home to a lonely apartment and spend the evening eating a tasteless microwave meal while watching mindless TV until I fell asleep. But once or twice a month, I would go out. On those nights, I left work and drove my car 50 miles to the north or south, or to the east or west, and to one of the clubs that I often frequented. I parked and walked inside and took a seat at the bar. I ordered a burger and a Virgin Mary and waited. It wasn't long before he took a seat next to me and ordered a beer. He was one of those nameless men who frequented bars like this and looked for women like me. I see it in his eyes as I take a drink from my glass. I smile inwardly and enter into a conversation with him since he's sitting here beside me. It's a conversation I've had many times and probably will again. I just wish he was someone else, someone I would rather be talking to. But he's here, and that one isn't. In fact, he won't be here tonight or any night. But this one is, so my conversation goes something like this. Okay, I know what you're going to say, so don't bother. Sure, I know what I look like and you're wondering. Just don't. My name's Meg, and I'm here for some fun, and that's all you need to know. And if you think you can find someone better, be my guest. Until then, you're pretty cute and I might just like to spend some time with you. If you play your cards right, you might get lucky. Care to try? He did, of course, and we're on our way to a motel. Just another nameless guy in another cheap room. For another night, I won't be alone, and I'll be his submissive 304 until we're both exhausted. He'll be able to tell his buddies that he scored with that gorgeous lady on Channel 9, and then try to convince them he's not lying. In the meantime, I can go home to an empty bed and an even more empty life. A life with as much sex as I want, but without the love that I gave away. I thought my beauty could buy me anything.
Surprise.
I still think back to when I thought that only good things happened to me because of my beauty. I learned early that there were no bad consequences to getting my way because of the gifts that God gave me. How stupid I was to believe that. Consequences are not always good. Consequences can be a bitch. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comment section below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.